Hope you're feeling refreshed. I did ask Chumma to open the windows. If you get cold, please do shout, but I find that people get sleepy without fresh air. Now, just to tell you, I do write a blog, and I have a card. My blog is called Challenging Thinking, and I have a card which tells you the blog address and also my email. My wife and I are planning to go to Thailand to do mission work, and if you're interested in getting our newsletter, please give me your email and I'll put you on our list and you can receive information about our lives, what we're doing, and you can pray for us. So please come and get these cards. I just had them made, so plenty of them. I was reading about a story to do with Enoch Powell, who was hated and loved in equal measure. If any of you remember Enoch Powell, he was a Conservative MP, but he became very famous, made a very controversial speech in 1968, became very famous, and he was driving into a town one day and he saw that there was an Enoch Powell lookalike competition, because he was being talked about in the nation, so it was an Enoch Powell lookalike competition. So he decided to go to this venue where this was being held, and he entered himself anonymously. And when the results were declared, he came third. So there were two people who looked more like he did than he did. That makes sense. Okay, so what do we do? So it's very easy to diagnose problems, isn't it? It's much harder to know what to do. I don't have any magic solutions, but just some things that I think we could do a lot better as God's people. How do we respond as a church? So let me get my slides. So how do we do gospel witness today? I think I've got about 8 points, and then we might do something interactive at the end for this time. The first thing to say is that today we need radical Christians in our nation. Judgment always begins with the house of God. We can't change our culture, but in some ways we can change ourselves. We need to lead radical lives for Christ in a very difficult age that we find ourselves in. I think there's something about our culture that will put you to sleep. If you think of a bicycle that rides forward with two wheels, there were two wheels of our culture. One is consumerism and one is entertainment. And one drives the other. So our economy drives the entertainment. Two wheels. And if they stop, our culture would fall off its bike because they keep everybody going. But there's a great danger, isn't there, that we can go to sleep with the culture. And we mustn't do that. We have to wake up to try to seek to reach this generation for Jesus. If you go to mission college, which I have done, you have all this stuff about how do you win Muslims for Jesus? How do you win Buddhists for Jesus? How do you win Jews for Jesus? But we don't talk enough about how do we win the West for Christ. We need to talk far more about that. So in desperate days, we need radical disciples. And I think that our society is going to become more and more difficult to live in. And if we don't learn to stand now, I don't think we're going to be able to stand when the day of evil really comes, which I think it will come. So we need to live lives devoted to Christ and serving his world. And whenever you think about what do we do, there's always the question that when people say to me, what do I do? There's all these things, what do I do? And I think what we have to do is to find out what God has given us to do and do it with all of our hearts. That's such a big question, isn't it? My children, sometimes my wife will say to them, what would you like to do when you leave school? And I'm trying to train my children to think biblically. And I say to them, what you need to do when you leave school or leave your education or leave university is think, what work does God have me to do in this world? And it might be to be a doctor, or it might be to be a teacher, or it might be to be an electrician. But because we are called to serve in God's world and serve him as we serve in whatever vocation that we're called into. We don't just serve God in the church, do we? We serve God in his world out there all the time. We must have a holistic view of life as God's people. You can be as much serving God as a mother as you can as a pastor. We mustn't make these silly distinctions that have disenfranchised people and made people think that they're second-class citizens because they're all called to be a social worker or because they're called to be a teacher or an electrician. We mustn't do that. Very, very damaging. But what God has called us to do, we must do that with all of our heart. In that place, that you in your small corner and I in mine. And so what do we do where we find ourselves? We must be bold in our witness. We must pray for blessing to come down in what we're doing. And we must be prepared to give an answer to everybody who asks us for the reason for the hope that is within us. Very important. And I think that we have to believe that people can be saved today. We have to believe that. Because I think sometimes we lose confidence that God will save people today. And I think also we have to live, these are just thoughts, we have to live with eternity in view all the time. I think this is the most important thing in our generation, where we just live for the moment. The postmodern world, it's the next thing we consume. Next bit of comfort food, the next holiday in the sun, the next little thing to give us a bit of extra hope to get us along a bit in the world, to survive, to function. And to live with eternity in view is an imperative for God's people today. I often think of John Wesley, who had that incredibly structured day. That's why they were called Methodists, because he had a method. They had a method about their day. He would rise at 4 o'clock, pray for 2 hours, and then family devotions for an hour. Things that we couldn't realistically do. But somebody said to him, if you knew that Christ was going to return tonight, what would you change about your day? And he said, nothing. I live every day like Christ will return tonight. And that's a real challenge to me. We must redeem the times, for the days are evil. Isn't that an interesting scripture? There's lots of reasons why you might redeem the time, but because the days are evil is probably the best one you could think of, because our evil days demand salt and light, that we be salt and light in this world. We must seek purity of heart, because it's only in purity that there is any power in the church. Spiritual power and joy. So that's the first thing. There's something about us that needs to be thought about. We need to live as radical Christians. Secondly, we need to remember that we are in a spiritual battle. The power of secularism, which we've talked about, is not just a set of ideas. It's much more than a battle with flesh and blood, isn't it? You think about a flesh and blood battle where you're wrestling with somebody. That's the flesh and blood image that I have in my mind. That's the kind of language that Paul used in Ephesians. We are in a battle with principalities and powers that are seeking to destroy the knowledge of God in the earth. And we recognise that when we deal with Muslims, that they're dealing with, we're in a spiritual battle. But do we see it in a materialistic society when the danger is we just see the material things? Because our society claims to be materialistic. It's not. It is influenced by demonic forces all the time. And that's what gives it such power. There's something more than just flesh and blood when you could lose your job for saying that homosexuality is sinful. There's something more than flesh and blood. There is a war against the knowledge of God in the earth. There's a war against God's created order. There's a war against marriage. There's a war against masculinity and femininity. So the response to the spiritual battle is that we must be a praying people. And I know we know that, but we must be a praying people. The fields are white for harvest. The first thing that Jesus says is, look at the fields, they're white for harvest, they're in danger of going to waste. Pray. We need to be a praying people. It's only in prayer that we receive any power. To see the strongholds of evil broken, we must believe that the church can make headway in this difficult day and age. And, something for parents. I'm a parent of 6 children. I would be hugely neglectful if I let my children go out into the world at 18 into university without having discussed all of this with them. Because they are going to get bombarded with a hugely anti-Christian worldview from the moment they arrive in university. And I've seen it so many times. So make sure that your children aren't exposed to any ideas that you haven't discussed with them already, or the big questions that they're going to face. The next point is know your audience. And this is partly an issue of relationships. I was discussing with some people in the coffee break about how if you want to win people who are thoroughly secularized today, you can't win them. Well, that's a big statement, but it's very difficult to win anybody unless you build a relationship with them. I don't think you'll ever win somebody who identifies as a homosexual person, same-sex attraction, or a Muslim for that matter, without building a relationship with them. And so that is the most time-consuming thing that I think the church has to be willing to embrace in a very busy life and busy world, that we need to build relationships with non-Christians. And here's the thing, that our society says something that is very hard to get beyond, that if you don't embrace somebody's lifestyle and celebrate it with them, then you can't love them. So if you know somebody who identifies as being having same-sex attraction, and that becomes a homosexual lifestyle, if you say to them that what they're doing is wrong, you by default hate them. And we as Christians have to be able to relate to people, eventually tell them what they're doing is wrong in that situation, and still love them. And our society says that's impossible. Do you see the dilemma we're facing? That's one of the biggest, huge things. But we have to know our audience, who we're talking to. It's very interesting in the Bible. I'm talking particularly about preaching now, but this applies to evangelism. That when Paul spoke to different audiences, he adapted his message because of who he was talking to. So when he spoke to at Thessalonica to the Jews in Acts 17, he assumed that they believed the scriptures, the Old Testament, the Torah, and he assumed also that they believed in creation. But when he went to Mars Hill and spoke to Gentiles, he had to tell them who God was. He started back because they didn't believe in the God of the Bible. And so Paul tailored his message according to who he was talking to. So what I'm saying to you is that if we think that our message should always be the same according to we always think, well, we have the gospel and it's always the same when we give it to every audience. We're very mistaken. So recently I spoke at a funeral of a very good friend of mine. And there were 70 non-Christians there. And so I spent a long time thinking, how do I connect with where these people are? So I said, Paul, my friend was called Paul. I called him Paul the dissenter. So I said, Paul, the most defining thing about Paul was he was a Christian. To be a Christian today takes enormous courage because you've got to go against the culture. So if you're a Christian today, you're called irrational, you're called bigoted, unscientific, all these things that you could be called. And I said, and Paul wasn't any of those things, and he risked being thought of as all those things because he knew that something was true. And so I kind of anticipated all of their objections before they could even think them. Do you see that? So then I could say, because today, if you're secular, you're thought of as a dissenter, you're kind of in the avant-garde, aren't you? You read The Guardian and you're a good left-wing liberal, you're fighting the forces of conservatism, you're fighting the Daily Mail, you're the dissenter. Actually, it's not true, is it? You're kind of most conformist of the lot. So to actually anticipate that, to be a Christian is to be a dissenter, because you're dissenting from the culture, is a way to get to people's under their skin. You speak at a funeral like that, well, you might convert people, but what you want to do is to give people something to challenge their world and life view. So, and Jesus did the same, didn't he? Jesus came into a situation in the New Testament in Israel where people were so familiar with the Jewish system of religion that they were inoculated against it. I'm talking about the New Testament times. The people Jesus talked to when he travelled around Israel, they'd heard about the Jewish system of religion and the priests and the whole Ten Commandments and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians, they were almost immune to it having any power over them because it was so familiar with them. And Jesus began at a different point with parables, to get under their skin, to go around the back of their defences and to reach them from behind, because they were immune from a frontal attack. Even Jesus, the Son of God, thought about, I don't know, thought about, but he had an approach that demonstrates to us that we need to think deeply about how we communicate with people today, according to the context that we're in. And how you preach to people 50 years ago is different to how you preach to people today when you get the opportunity. And the same when you do one-to-one evangelism, to get around people's defences. Next thing is, preach or share the gospel with today's context in the background. I think I've said this to you already. If you're a preacher, but this applies in personal evangelism as well, relationships. What are those 4 hooks that should define your life of the Christian worldview? Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. I'm talking now as a preacher. When I'm preaching, I'm always trying to build a worldview into people who are listening to me. I'm trying to get them to think in terms of big categories. And when I'm looking at a passage I'm trying to teach, I'm always trying to say, am I helping people establish a good view of God as the Creator? Am I helping people to see that our big problem is sin? It's not, I don't know, a psychological disorder that we have. It's sin. I'm trying to think, is our hope in Jesus' redemption, is in his death and resurrection? Am I pointing people towards the Christian's hope of restoration? Am I doing that? Does my preaching hang on those big categories? Because I don't want my Christianity to be about religion and spirituality. I want it to be about reality. This is what the world is about. I don't know if you can understand that. I listen to a lot of people preach and I think, your preaching is not about reality. It's in a separate category to where people really live. It's not about being a human being. It's not about how you relate to people in the culture. It's not about how you think about your ethics. It's over here in some little world with God that you're appealing to, instead of rooting it in the real world of reality. Does that make sense? And that's why we need to be worldview thinkers. We're always thinking about our Christian worldview. So, when you try to define what a worldview is, you can have all sorts of complex definitions. But when I teach a worldview, I say a worldview answers the biggest questions of all. What are the biggest questions of all? Why is the world here? Is there a God? If there is a God, who is that God? What does it mean to be a human being? What is success in life? What's failure in life? What happens when we die? These are what I call the biggest questions of all. And a worldview answers those questions. But all of those worldview questions are contested, aren't they? All the time. So when we're preaching, we need to be seeking to answer those huge questions for people. And also when we talk to people. I mean, there's no good about saying to somebody that homosexual practice is wrong, unless you can establish, first of all, that there is a God who calls it wrong, and that they're accountable to him. Otherwise, you're just dealing with, you're not going back far enough. You're just dealing with somebody here who doesn't believe in God, or they say they don't believe in God, and they don't think that they have any accountability beyond their own life anyway, so it's just irrelevant. We've got to go back far enough where we establish certain things, and I don't think we do that often enough. Does that make sense? But think about when you talk to people, when you preach, if you preach, what is contested in the world? I've just written down a list of things here. Truth is contested. Is the truth? Or is all truth just your own personal construct? Authority is questioned, isn't it? Meaning, success, suffering, death, what happens when you die? All these things are contested. And I think we need to be able to show to people that we are engaging with those kind of questions. I mean, the whole issue, for example, the whole issue of men and women in marriage, and if you believe that the Bible calls a wife to submit to a husband, it's all tied in with a certain view of authority, isn't it? And our society says authority is always power. And actually in the Bible, authority is that you do have authority, but you work for the good of the one that you have authority over, for their own good. And if you're a husband and you have authority in your family, you're under the authority of God, and you're responsible for any authority that you use in your family to God one day. So just a right view of authority has to be established, because our society's got such a wrong view of authority. Authority is always negative. It's always so you can prosper yourself or get what you want. Can you see these things have to be talked about? The things that are contested. We've got to hit these targets. I think as well that there is this secular narrative, isn't there? This secular narrative that we hear, and it's enormously arrogant and self-congratulatory that the secular view of the world is correct, that the world is an accident, that we're just, the world is an accident, that we're an accident too. We've evolved to where we are today, through all these mutations and survival of the fittest, and now we've evolved a sense of morality, and we can define what's good about the world and all those kind of things. And I think the whole kind of module, the whole thing, not module, the whole of the secular worldview is just full of problems that we have to be able to deconstruct. So, people sometimes they say to me, so you believe in the virgin birth? And I say, do you believe in the virgin birth of the universe? You see the issue, they think the universe has come from nothing. So I might believe in the virgin birth, that life came from a human being came from a virgin, but they believe in the virgin birth of the universe. That's a far bigger leap of faith than they have. So secularists believe without any evidence that the universe is an accident, that life is an accident, that genetic code is an accident, that human consciousness is an accident, that reason is an accident, and logic, they all came into being by chance. We don't call people out enough on these kind of things. We have to challenge people. So, we think we're moral, but we abort 200,000 babies a year. We care more about the destruction of birds' eggs on a cliff face in Scotland than we do about the unborn. We think we're moral. Are we really moral? We have to expose this idea that we're tolerant, and so on and so on. People say, oh, well, how can you believe in a God when there's all this suffering in the world? And I say, well, suffering is only an issue if human beings have any value. But in your worldview, if they're secularists, you have no value because you're just highly evolved pond slime. How can highly evolved pond slime suffer? How can just a collection of molecules suffer? At least in my worldview, you've got human beings have value because they're made in God's image, and then you can suffer. But in your worldview, there's no such thing as suffering. What is suffering anyway? It's just molecules banging up against each other. We need to learn to deconstruct the secular project, extract the poison. I think part of the problem that we face with this generation is that the things that our society has settled to fight for and to be heroic over are really pretty sad. Just the whole environmental cause. Not that we shouldn't be concerned about the environment because it's God's creation. But there are bigger things to fight than saving the whale and global warming. And we need to inspire a whole generation to realise that a lot of the things that people are struggling over and fighting for and being heroic over, there are far bigger things that we need to battle for. The gospel itself. Real human dignity. The judgment of God that we need to remind people of is a far bigger issue than global warming, for example. What else? Where's my time? Okay. So, next, number 5. I think we need to teach that Christianity is true and that it makes sense to believe. Too much Christianity is based on this idea that Christianity is about something that will help you. You've got difficulty in your marriage, so Jesus will help you. Life is difficult. You need some meaning in life. God will give you meaning in life. But actually, Christianity doesn't just impact our experience and our will. It is, and I said this to you before, it is a claim of truth about the universe. And therefore the gospel is reasonable, and it's true, and it is historical, because God has acted in history. So it's very interesting, isn't it, when Paul was before Festus in Acts 26, that he was accused of being out of his mind, wasn't he? And he said, "My dear Festus, I'm not out of my mind. The gospel is both true and reasonable." So the gospel is true and reasonable. It's not untrue and it's not unreasonable. So the gospel kind of makes sense of the world. It makes sense to believe that this world is a created world. It makes sense, doesn't it, to think that we've actually been created. It makes far more sense than that the world is an accident, that it's been created by a powerful and intelligent creator. It makes sense to believe that there is something wrong with us, human sin, that we human beings are a glorious ruin, that we have fallen from what we once were. I think it was Oliver Sacks, who was a psychiatrist, wrote lots of books, died not very long ago. He has this amazing quote. I don't have it here, but he has this quote, and he said, "In all my psychological research, I've come to the conclusion that we human beings have got something in our distant memory where the world was perfect, it was good, and everything was in order, and somewhere everything became broken, and we descended, but we're never able to lose that memory of what we once were as a race." And you think, billions and billions of pounds and dollars on research into drugs and psychiatry, and he just gets to Genesis 3. Isn't that amazing? It's interesting when you think about drugs that the pharmaceutical industry makes for psychiatric illness and so on. There are two types, really. There are stimulants and there are sedatives, or sedatives and stimulants. And I often think that the sedatives are to replace the peace that was lost in Eden, and the stimulants are to replace the joy that was also lost in Eden. Because somewhere we are not what we were. It makes sense to believe that we are fallen. We have this incredible value and dignity, and yet we are capable of building gas chambers as well as finding cures for cancer. Christianity is historical. Jesus came and he lived and he died and he rose in history. So Christianity is not outside the categories of true and false. It's not in some spiritual little section of life. It's either true or it's false. It's not excluded from the categories of reason and thought. It can be defined with words. It can be located in history. So the Bible is real knowledge. This is what Schaeffer was all about. It's about real knowledge, not some irrational knowledge, spiritual knowledge. It's about real knowledge about the Bible. The God who is really there, who has spoken. The Bible isn't some faith thing that's separate to reason, that can't be defined and defended. It can be defined and defended. That's what our society's done to the gospel. It's pushed it out into this category of irrationality so it can control reality. So we need to show people these things. Next thing, we need to answer people's questions. I heard about this family who are well known to a friend of mine, and they had a daughter, and she began to have doubts about the Christian faith. This is a shocking story. I know this is not representative, but it's a shocking story. But she had doubts about the Christian faith, and she wrote them in a diary. And her mother, when she was 16, their parents were very kind of strict and reformed, particularly, strongly in that way. When the mother found this diary with all these doubts that her daughter was having, they threw her out of her home, deciding that she was one of the reprobate because she had doubts about the Christian faith. And I know that's a shocking example, but the point is that we need to listen to people's doubts and seek to answer their questions, because often people's doubts, they come from real issues that they have, because they've been brought up in a society where they've already been brainwashed into thinking in a certain way. And we have to listen to people. So, Charles Taylor, who's a Canadian academic, who's written a book called Charles Taylor's written a book called The Secular Age. Secular Age, yeah. He talks about defeater beliefs, that there are things that people believe are so powerful that they've defeated the gospel already. We don't need to talk about the gospel because these beliefs have already defeated Christianity. Things like suffering, sexuality, the uniqueness of Jesus, the meaning of tolerance, science. And I think we need to find ways to answer people's questions. I have a file on my computer, a Word file, and I work hard at preparing answers to questions that I anticipate people will have for me. So I was in Lush not very long ago in Liverpool. It's the biggest Lush in the world. Do you know Lush? You smell it before you see it. And when you get in there, you've got to sell your house just to buy a few bath bombs before it gets so expensive. And I was talking to the lady over the counter, and she asked me all these questions. We talked about morality because I was saying that Lush is an immoral shop because it charges so much money. And we talked about the nature of morality. And it was really helpful that in my mind I'd anticipated questions about morality and I could answer these questions. And I try to do that. Francis Schaeffer talks about honest questions, honest answers for honest questions. Rabbi Zachariah says, questions matter because people matter. We need to learn to answer people's questions and think hard about how we do that. Next is that we must weep for this generation. Is that 2? We must weep for this generation rather than condemn it. I've already mentioned this morning. Francis Schaeffer, who I'm studying for my PhD, who was a very profound Christian apologist. He died in 1984. He was called the second weeping prophet because he loved people and he loved non-Christians and he spent hours with them. And when people talked to him, the thing that they said about him was that he always made them feel like they were the most important person in the world. And he had time for people. And I think we need to remember that, it's very easy for people who come from a more conservative background to focus on the fact that people suppress the truth. I believe that with all my heart. People are in a rebellion against God. But I also think we have to remember that people who are born into this society have never had the Bible read to them. They're born into a nation where the Word of God is rare and where reality is controlled and mediated by two people constantly, by the media. They have a kind of drug that's fed to them of what the world is about. And, we need to remember that there is a sense in which people are guilty of suppressing the truth, but they're also victims of a society that's drug them into sleepiness and establish what the world's about already. We must feel the emptiness of life without God, the suicide rates, the mental health issues, children raised without hope. The gospel is a moral issue, isn't it? It's about right and wrong before God in the end. God is a holy God, and it's a moral matter. But the gospel is also an existential issue. It's about what the world is about. We mustn't forget that. It's about existence. What's it mean to be human? And I think more of our preaching needs to focus on human existence than it does. Does that make sense? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live? What does it mean to have meaning in the world? I heard a story you may have heard this before, about a church that went to a seminary in America, a theological college in America, and they asked for a new pastor. And they said, oh, please could you send us one who is a good hellfire preacher. So they sent him one, sent the church one. This man came and he preached for a month in the church, and then they sent him back to the seminary. So they sent another one, and he spent a month there, and then they sent him back. And they went through 6, and then the 7th one came from the seminary, and he stayed for 10 years. And many years later, somebody from the seminary met up with the people who were calling a pastor in the church, and they said, how come this final one stayed for 10 years? And they said to this seminary, well, we finally got a preacher who was a hellfire preacher who didn't want people to go there. Isn't that very good? Number 8, we must preach hope. Laurie Santos, quote from him, he said, our children are chasing dreams. He talked about our society. Our children are chasing dreams that are not going to work. They are anxious and depressed. They have no hope. Anxiety stalks our land. And yet we live at a time when our society is safer than it's ever been in all sorts of ways. Number 9. Community matters. We must be a community of love in a loveless world. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. You know, Francis Schaeffer said, the church must be right. In other words, what he meant was it should be a place of correct doctrine. Schaeffer said the church must be right, but it must also be beautiful. The church must be right, but it must also be beautiful. You know, when I think about my own testimony, I was raised in a Christian family. I rejected the Christian faith when I was 14 and then came back to the Lord when I was about 17, 18 years old. One of the things that brought me back to the church was that when I was a little boy, I came to love the church, and I never wanted to be outside of the boundaries of the church because I'd found the church to be a beautiful thing. I came to love the church. The love of the church has never left me. And we have to help people to love the church. And it doesn't help when we bicker and fight about things. Number 10, we have to face people up with Jesus Christ. We don't do this enough. I'm going to talk to you tomorrow night about the uniqueness of Jesus. His claims, his character, his actions. Jesus Christ is our greatest apologetic. He doesn't compare to anybody else. His claims are either comic or they are cosmic. Is that right? They're either comic or they're cosmic. Yes, that's right. Nobody else claimed the things that Jesus Christ claimed. This idea that Jesus Christ is just a good teacher, just so shallow, isn't it? You don't say that you're going to judge the world and that you existed before Abraham and that you are the resurrection and the life. If people believe in you, that they're going to live forever. You don't say things like that and just be a good teacher. You're either a nutcase, a madman, or you're a liar. Jesus Christ, there's something about his uniqueness that stands in a world of plurality and screams at us to take notice of him. And I think we need to proclaim the uniqueness of Jesus. I'll just read you a statement of Francis Schaeffer. Bible-believing Christians are locked in a battle of cosmic proportions. It is a life and death struggle over the minds and souls of men for all eternity. But it is equally a life and death struggle over life on this earth. But if we are to win this battle on the stage of human history, it will take a prior commitment to fighting the spiritual battle with the weapons that will be effective. It will take a life committed to Christ, founded on truth, lived in righteousness and grounded on the gospel. We've got, how long? 10 minutes. I was going to do an exercise with you, but 15 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
15 minutes, okay. Should we just talk and take some questions? Yeah, well, let's do that, yes.
Yeah, previous talk, as an illustration, you were saying now that, we are taught how to reach Muslims, how to reach Muslims,
Yes.
With the gospel and so on.
Yep.
And what occurred to me then...
Sorry, Andrew. I realised the people in the kitchen weren't able to hear the questions. So if I get you to just repeat the question on there.
Yeah, okay. In the previous talk, you were saying how that, if you like, at seminary or wherever, we're taught how to reach Muslims, Hindus, whatever. But what occurred to me was, do we think about how to reach Christians for Christ? Because so much of our Christianity, and I speak for myself, can be second-hand.
Yes.
We sing about other people's relationship with God. We sing about other people's experiences of God. We read about how precious and beautiful God ought to be to us. Yeah. And one of my favourite sayings of Jesus was, he said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Yep. And the fact is that if we're just regurgitating everybody else's experience of God and don't have our own experience of God, we actually haven't got anything to offer. So how do we reach Christians for Christ? That's my question.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that. I think that in everything I'm saying, I'm not suggesting for one moment that we shouldn't be radical Christians who've encountered God ourselves. You know, you think about Isaiah and Isaiah 6. When he had an encounter when he encountered God, and it changed his life and prepared him for ministry. You know, for the ministry he was called to. And so I think that the authority of a life comes from having encounters with God. I really do think that. But I also think that we can learn things that are valuable. And we can make them our own. So we can read books and we can think, but we mustn't think that that's, once it's second-hand, it can't become ours. Because God has given a heritage to the church of good thinking, you know, through people in history and people today who've written things, and I think we can meditate on them, we can think about them, they can become part of our own story, which has traction with other people. So it's like people who don't believe in reading commentaries before they preach. I used to think that, you know, got it all from God in some experience. I think both of them have a place in the Christian's life. So I think you can read a good book on Christian worldview and apologetics, and it can be very valuable to you in your talking to people. Second-hand knowledge is a problem if it doesn't become part of you. I think that's the issue. If it's just a detached knowledge. Yes, I think that is a problem. Yeah.
So what I thought was, if I have to bring you might go around,
and I have that.
If you speak to this.
Sure.
I know we had a question reserved from the previous session, so if you could ask the question there.
Thanks. A few years ago we had some fantastic messages about Daniel and how the Babylonians, their strategy for winning the people of Israel was to re-educate the children. In view of that, I mean, I was a teacher for 40 years and I've seen, like you've seen, how education has changed. Do you think the case for Christians to homeschool or put their children into a Christian school is now getting overwhelming?
A very controversial issue, and it's very difficult to talk about because people have commitments in it. My wife and I decided to homeschool, and we do homeschool, but we're going to send our 14-year-old to school now. When I went to school, when I was at primary school particularly, it was a different world to today. There's no doubt about it. You know, there were things about it that were kind of secular, but there wasn't the hostility to Christianity. There wasn't the whole sexual agenda that's being taught, and what we're facing now is the government passing a law. Whether they'll change this with the Conservative government coming into power, getting a majority, they might change this. I'm hoping that they will, where parents can't take their children out of a class on sex education. Well, that is a milestone, because now parents haven't got final authority over their children, and that's deeply, deeply worrying. Now, I know some parents, I think you've got to do what's right for you. Some parents can't homeschool. The mother and father have to work just to pay the bills. And there aren't many Christian schools around. But I think as a church community in Britain, we need to think about how do we raise the next generation to not be brainwashed by the secular world. I think we need to think about that because we're not thinking about it enough. That is part of our discipleship. If we can't raise our children in the fear and instruction of the Lord and teach them a Christian world and life view, there is something deeply wrong with our Christianity. And we've got to address that. But it's a very difficult subject. I was speaking about these things in Reading, and there's one guy who's a deputy head of a school. He's never spoken to me since after saying that. But I do think we need to grasp the nettle on it, because it's intolerable that our children are going to a situation and when they're 7 years old, they're being taught that they might be their gender might be trapped in the wrong body. There's something deeply wrong with being taught that homosexuality is just a normal thing. And even on a broader scale, that the whole of the world can be explained without reference to God. That's a deep, deep omission on the part of Christians, that we would allow teachers to shape our children's minds that say we can do science and history and geography and English literature and all those other things and understand all of those subjects without any reference to God. There's an enormous accommodation to our culture even in doing that, because God is the centre of the universe. And I think probably we are too scared to face it, because it will have a huge repercussions for our lives. But I think we're going to have to. Otherwise, we're going to lose all of our children. We just can't do that. We cannot feed our children to the lions. We wouldn't dream of of exposing our children to, hopefully we wouldn't, to pornography on the internet. We wouldn't let them cross the road on their own. But we give them to teachers to be shaped in their minds without any thought. And that's the problem.
Any other questions?
Thanks. Much of what you said has been very helpful. I'm still struggling to see or to understand, this issue about extracting the poison, engaging people. What does that look like in the day-to-day?
Yeah, I think actually when I was speaking, I've probably not done that very well. I think extracting the poison for me means diminishing some of the toxic things that people perceive about the gospel. By answering people's questions, by engaging with people. I mean, the gospel will always be offensive in one sense. But I think for a lot of people, it's more offensive. Or wrong, it's considered to be offensive in ways that it actually isn't. I think there are many things that the gospel is enormously attractive. The gospel gives incredible hope and dignity to human beings, gives purpose in life. And I think that, Christians are we're not homophobic. We are homophilic. We love homosexuals. We want them to go to heaven. We have an incredible basis for challenging racism and sexism, because human beings, whether you're male or female or whether you're black or white, all made in God's image. There are things about the gospel that are wonderfully life-affirming, and our society needs to hear. But I think the problem is that people in our society have heard a version of Christianity that is so distorted and crooked that we have to try to straighten out some of that crookedness so that we make it possible for people to hear the gospel. Now, obviously, the Holy Spirit's got to work, and I'm not diminishing any of that. But I think we can, just in loving people and embracing them, realizing that, not being threatened, realizing that, there is a system out there, and if you say things in your job, you might lose your job. I understand all that. But human beings are still human beings. We have problems, we have needs, we have difficulties. And getting to know people and showing people love and concern and being able to help people to challenge their distortions of Christianity in order that we make it easier for the gospel medicine to go down. I think that's what I mean by extracting the poison. And I think that takes a tremendous commitment, because we have to get to know people. We can't, win people over a cup of coffee. It would be nice if we could. And I think as well that if you look at churches that grow, like, I'm not affirming necessarily the whole model, but if you look at churches like New Frontiers, they do an awful lot of social stuff. So I've got a friend who's in a New Frontiers church, who was in a New Frontiers church, and he has a house group that he runs, about 10 people. Every third week in the spring and the summer, they have a social event. And the people in the group, they bring their neighbours, they bring their family who aren't Christians to a social thing, and they do social things together. You know, they have a games night, they have a barbecue night in the summer. And they are bold in bringing their non-Christian friends and family along to it. Or, I don't know, they do all sorts of things that you could imagine doing, going out for a walk on a summer evening. And they just build relationships. And what happens is that some of the barriers are broken down. These Christians are not so weird after all. And even they have something to live for that they haven't got. I've got a friend in Cambridge, and he said to me, Andrew, we're going to win this, I mean, Christians are going to win in this land for Jesus, for the gospel. And I said, why do you think that? And he said, because we've got something this world hasn't got. We've got hope. And our society is bereft of hope, is empty of hope. I mean, this whole mental illness thing, this is just a byproduct of a postmodern world where there is nothing to live for. And at some point, people in our land will hear the gospel. I mean, for lots of reasons, our economy will not last forever. 8 million people might die of the coronavirus, and we'll realise that our lives are brief and they're fragile, and that we can't fix everything in the world. Who knows? But this nation is under God's judgment. Adrian Rogers, who was an American preacher, used to say when he was preaching, people say to me, God is our only hope in America. And he said, well, God is our greatest threat as well. And, God is going to, if we don't repent of our sins as a nation, God is going to shake this nation to the core. And at some point, people will turn to the church. And we need to be ready to speak to them. You can see it in history. Between 1914 and 1918, the First World War, people say when they study, why did people leave the church? That was a milestone, a watershed. After the First World War, men stopped going to church. And I tell you why I think it was. I think it was because between 1870 in Britain and 1914, the church in Britain became liberal. They abandoned their ideas of sin and God's justice and God's holiness. And the church was liberalised. And when the world went to war with itself in 1914, and there was depravity and wickedness and all sorts of things just everywhere, people came to the church and said, can you explain this to us? And nobody could explain it because they'd abandoned their notion of sin. We've got an incredible explanation for sin. It's in the 3rd chapter of the Bible. And the church couldn't do it, and people thought the church has got no answers. And they were right, because they'd become liberal. And I think we need to be ready when things go badly wrong, as they will do in our society, to communicate the gospel to people. And I don't think we should be too intimidated by our society as well. That's very easy to say. It's easy for me to say because I'm not in a secular job anymore. Not that I believe in secular jobs, but I'm not in a kind of job where I'm being employed by somebody at the moment. Easy for me to say. But we should try not to be intimidated by the ideas of our age. In 100 years' time, everybody around us will be dead and will have stood before God to give an account of their lives. There is something about the fear of God that needs to remove the fear of man.
Yeah, you mentioned the daughter who was thrown out because she doubted. Do you think that you need to tackle also maybe that the church itself, because of just being religious, that you've got to say, well, you can't identify with that because when Jesus came, there were people who were religious who opposed him. So, and classic example is Thomas. Thomas doubted, but Jesus didn't throw him out. So those people who threw their daughter out, you can't try not to hide it under the carpet, but actually say, no, there were people, it was just religion, and differentiate the difference between religion and true Christianity.
Yes, I do. When I think about Francis Schaeffer believed in, I don't know anything about Francis Schaeffer, but he started this organisation called L'Abri in Switzerland, which means the shelter. And there were all these baby boomers who'd gone on the hippie trail to Kathmandu and come back disillusioned. And they came to L'Abri and stayed with their long hair and smelly armpits and flea-ridden bodies and slept in his beds and everything. And he talked to them. And the motto of L'Abri is by demonstration God. Not just by talking, but demonstrating. He demonstrated the love of God to people. But he engaged with people, he listened to them. And they all came most of them came as deep skeptics, and many of them left as believers. Because he wanted to give them something real, but also he was willing to have the patience to listen to all their doubts and bear with them. And I think, yes, we do need to do that. Does that answer your question? We do need to do it with people. And I think there probably is a lot of religion in the church that's not helpful. And I think we often have a very divided life, Christianity, where we have spirituality over here and then real life over here. Instead of we're saying, what is reality? Christianity is a claim on reality. This is either true or it's false. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, as Paul said, we might as well all go home and eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. It's either, it's not. It can't just be something that gives us a bit of comfort. You can find a bit of comfort in 1,000 things. I find comfort in my coffee in the mornings, but it's not. Doesn't mean that my coffee's true in that sense. Very recently, I was in about a month ago. I was in North Yorkshire, and I went to Fountains Abbey. It's this massive old abbey that was closed down by Henry VIII. It was a freezing cold day, and when we got into the abbey, you have to walk about a mile to get there. It was snowing, and I heard all this Gregorian chanting. Is that what it is? There's choir in this old sort of room, and there were all these men dressed in robes, and they were singing these, I don't know what you call them, some Catholic sonnets or something. And and when I got there and I watched them, I thought, this is religion. This has nothing to do with Christianity. This is just a subset of culture. These people have no interest in the gospel, they don't know anything about Christ, the Bible, or God, but this is religion. And I think that there is a lot of that in the historic church. And there's been an awful lot of that in the Anglican church, and the Anglo-Catholic church was all of that, the Tractarian movement, the Oxford movement. And, this is the great sadness about our society today, is that what people who are not Christians think Christianity is what the church has given them over the centuries. And it's been a travesty of the truth. So this is why we have to have compassion for people. Because what they've been given is so false. And I don't blame them for thinking that's just a load of nonsense, unrelated to the real world. It smells and bells and all that stuff. It is nonsense. And, this is why there's something beautiful about the truth of the gospel that we need to not only preach but embody as God's people. And I think, Tim Chester, do you know Tim Chester? He's written a book called Total Church. Total Church? That is a very, very helpful book. Because Tim Chester is really thinking about how we reach non-Christian people today. And he thinks it's because we welcome people into the fellowship of God's people and we love them. And over time they begin to think, what is different about these people? The thing that brought me back to the church was, I love the church, but I realised one day that these believers that I came back among when I was about 17, that they had something I didn't have. They had a hope, they had a purpose, they had a meaning. They knew that their sins were forgiven. They had a joy that was kind of contagious. I knew a lady in that same church, and she worked in London. And she was so bubbling over with the joy of the Lord that people would come to her every day and say, we can't work you out. There's something different about you that we haven't got. And, in all I'm saying about being able to engage with people in terms of apologetics and answer people's questions, there also has to be this sense that we've met with the living God. Yeah. And that encounter has so changed us that it's left a mark on us that people can see. We have to articulate it as well and talk to people. We can't just hang on to that. But the reality of God is the biggest thing in our lives, and we live in the light of that reality in all that we do, all we think. So I know some people in East Anglia, they've just lost their baby. Their baby was born, 5 days later he died. And it's a very sad situation, but several of their neighbours have said to them, the way you've handled this has staggered us. It's not that Christians shouldn't be people who are, false or stoics. That's not what I mean. That's equally bad. But these neighbours have said to them, the way you've handled this has demonstrated that your Christianity is real. Because, the gospel is working itself out in the real world. Yes.
So the children of Israel were told to tie tassels on their garments. They were trying to tie the word of God on their head. And obviously many of them took it and literally did it, but didn't read it and didn't talk about it on the way. How do we... I suppose I'm trying to challenge myself as well when we're thinking about bringing God's word into the workplace. I think you're saying that we need to go back a step further and be talking about almost these principles that are very different. And it might be good to talk through some examples of how to do that. I was just thinking about training. We talk about different generations, different attitudes between Gen Y, Millennial, Gen Z. And I'm conscious I've had conversations about that, but there was opportunities there perhaps to bring in the fact that we don't have privilege, we don't have rights, we have privileges and differences in the different generations. Are there, other things that we should be doing more in that regard? And also, how do we talk talk more in the way? Children, do they grow up, are they just playing all the time with each other rather than actually being challenged by adults and sharpening each other?
You're talking about raising children, our own children. Yeah, let's start with the children thing. On the children thing, I don't think we're intentional enough about how we raise our kids. So by default, we just do what the world does. Dump in front of the telly too much, or let them play on computer games too much, or play out. I think we need to be intentional and have a serious approach to raising our children that is thought through, properly thought through, because otherwise the years just go by and they're gone. Someone's written a book, I think it's Ted Paul Tripp, called Teenage Years, the Years of Opportunity. And they are incredible years of opportunity, but often we don't use the opportunity we've got. So I think we've allowed a play culture to affect us and our children. That children should just play around, go to school and they play and all that. And instead, I think we should think all the time, if I've got 4 boys, I should be thinking they will be men one day. What kind of a man do I want them to be? And try to redeem each day. So I don't do this perfectly, but from 7:30 till 8 o'clock, my son and I study the Bible together this year. Next year we're going to study systematic theology together. The year after we're going to study apologetics together. When he was 9, I taught him a catechism. I want him to be learned in Christian things. And it's not just formal, but we talk about things, Deuteronomy 6, as we go along the road and all that stuff. Just to go back to mention something, your question. The children of Israel did not give their well, they wouldn't have been allowed to give their children to the Canaanites to be educated. And we need to think about that. Your other question was concrete things. I think we need to, in apologetics, I'm a presuppositionalist, all right? All of us, whether we're Christians or non-Christians, we presuppose God's existence all the time to make sense of the world. Because this is God's world, and we are made in God's image. So when you talk to non-Christians, they are assuming that God exists just by existing and by talking. So when somebody claims that something is immoral, we need to ask them what the basis of their morality is. When somebody puts their faith in science, we need to say, well, what's the basis of why you can do science if you've got a monkey brain? How can you trust it if it's just evolved to survive? So I think that there is a nice way that we need to deconstruct people's unbelief. Because all the time people are presupposing God just by how they think. So, you meet somebody who's homosexual, their homosexual life, same-sex attraction, and they say, oh, it's wrong how, they told you they're an atheist. It's wrong how you Christians have treated us. And I'll say, I'm really sorry, but you've given up the right to say anything's wrong. I said, what do you mean I can say anything's wrong? But you just tell me you're an atheist. In your world, there's only molecules. There is no right and wrong. What you think is wrong is different to what somebody else is wrong. What I think is wrong. It's all our own preference, and then there's no right and wrong. But you're claiming there's right and wrong, so actually you know in your heart of hearts there's a God. Because you know somewhere that there is right and wrong. When somebody talks about justice, so where do you get justice from in the world of molecules? Or when somebody says, oh, it's terrible, all these people are dying of famine in the Yemen. You could say, well, why is it wrong? I mean, they're just highly evolved pond slime. That's all they are. They've got no value. They're just, that is evolution. The strong survive, the weak die. Who cares? Who says anything like that matters in any way whatsoever? It's irrelevant whether people live or die if you're a Darwinian. That's just the way the world works. That's how progress happens. That's how we've evolved. That's how we've got here. But actually, you know that they matter. Because deep down in you, you know that people are made in God's image and they do matter. They've got value. So I think, this notion of deconstructing unbelief is something that we need to think deeply about. When I talk to people about presupposition apologetics, they all switch off. Like this big word. Actually, it's a very simple thing to recognize that just in people's everyday conversation and the way that they assume things to be true, they're pointing to God because this is God's world. And that's different to evidentialism, where people just argue the toss forever about evidence.
Like taking the poison out of people's system is part of that deconstructing. Yes. Because of time, and also Andrew will be around for lunch, and you can talk to him and ask various questions afterwards as well. I did wonder, so it's helpful to have in mind that in terms of the truth and the beauty of the gospel seen in the church, which we hope will practice more and more as the Holy Spirit helps us, is the positive, the kind of, and knowing the deconstruction of society. You had some books that I saw on the list, on the PowerPoint. Are there any book recommendations? That we could...
I've forgotten all about those. Oh yeah. So that's my blog. So I write a blog. My wife thinks I work too hard on it, neglecting her and the kids. But I write kind of essays on it. Really, it's like a series of essays. So I've got these cards, and you can take one of these if you want, with my blog address on it, and it's on there. So I kind of write once a month, and it's got essays on all sorts of different issues, challenging thinking, and then so Total Truth by Nancy Pearcey is a very good book to read. One of the things I think is that we don't work hard enough to develop a Christian mind. And, these books, you've got to work at them. And I think it's a very important book. It's about how the Christianity has been stuffed into a little spiritual space and doesn't deal with reality. It's very helpful. And then Stealing from God, Frank Turek. What I was talking to you about before, how our secular culture steals from a Christian worldview to make sense of the world. That is the best book on that. It's really helpful. That changed my life. Stealing from God by Frank Turek. It's a really, really helpful book. What's it say? Why atheists need God to make their case. It's very, very good. Really helpful book. These. Sorry. It's published by possibly Thomas Nelson. But I mean, just Google it, you'll find it. And then I would read John Lennox, Gunning for God. That's really helpful. That's a very good book. Very, very good book. Why the New Atheists are missing the target. I've read that twice. It's really very, very well written book. But I don't have too much time to read, so I listen to people. This is the great advantage, isn't it? Yesterday when I was on the train coming down from Liverpool, I put my phone on my phone. I was listening to a lecture from Tim Keller while I was coming down, and I didn't put the jack in far enough, and so the speaker was on as well as the headphones. And after I didn't realise this, but this lady came down the carriage and she tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "Excuse me, sir, but this is the quiet carriage." And I had no idea that she could hear it as well, as could the whole carriage, because this has got a really powerful speaker on it. That's why I bought it. It's got a really powerful speaker. I didn't mean for them to all hear it, but they did. And but I listen. When I'm washing up, when I'm changing my baby's nappy, when I've got my kids in the bath, I'm always listening to things. It's probably not very good parenting. You're supposed to be engaging with them, but anyway, I always listen to things. And if you want the best book on presupposition apologetics, which is a very easy book to read, really, Greg Barneson, Always Ready. That's an awesome book. It's expensive to buy, but you can buy it as a Kindle for about £7. £7. So that's very good.
Thank you. Andrew, I'm on behalf of everyone who's here, I'm sure we want to give you a big thank you for the session that you led. Perhaps we can give a round of applause for Andrew and all that he's prepared for us. So, as I mentioned before, there's lunch if you want to stay, and I'm sure you'll be able to kind of ask Andrew more questions about the things that he's spoken about. And also, if you have questions to him about Thailand, kind of his future there, it'll be interesting to find out more as well. Tomorrow, in the Sunday services in Hayes, he'll be speaking to us a little bit about his plans for Thailand, and also preaching God's word in the morning and evening service. It's a pleasure to spend time together with you guys in this way for this training morning. I thought we'll end by singing a hymn together to get our lungs moving again. And then I'll close in prayer for the session, for Andrew, and also for the meal. So let's sing together hymn number 464. 464, knowing that we have this marvelous gospel. We can go forth and tell this world which is without hope, this world which is crumbling, as we were thinking about, this glorious hope and this gospel that we have. So hymn number 464, Go forth and tell, O Church of God, awake.